Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Kyle Clark. For the last 20 years or so, I've been a journalist at 9 News, KSUA. Oh, thank you, that's lovely. 9 News, KUSA, the NBC affiliate in Denver, Colorado. And it's an exciting time to be in local news. I'll be the moderator today. For the purposes of the recording, today's date is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. The panel time is 2 p.m. Mountain. Panel title is Extra Extra, Read All About It, Do Billionaires Control the News? Kudos to whomever is coming up with the uplifting titles for this year's sessions. And kudos to you for being here opposite another session which I noted was titled Building a Brighter Future for the World. So you chose this over that. Before we get started with our panel discussion, I'd like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgment. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you for your attention to that. And once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. You all look like a rowdy crowd, so we ask that our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions, signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions, i.e. hooting and or hollering, are not permitted, and those will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience, and we'll take questions via handwritten note cards. Which means you actually have to put a question on it, not just a statement, but a question ends in a question mark. Please raise your hand if you have said question. Producer will hand you a note card and a pencil. Please print on there. Note if you're a student, if you would, please note on the card if you are a student, then raise your hand with the completed card and the producer will collect it and bring it up here. And we're gonna leave robust time at the end of this for questions, about 20 minutes or so. I'd now like to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves in turn and remind everyone there that full speaker bios can be found online at the CWA website. Karine?
Hi everyone, my name's Karine Hajar, and I am an opinion journalist at the Washington Post, and I write about politics and all other kinds of fun things. And I'm really grateful to be here with such a great panel.
Hi, I'm Laura Lindenfeld, and in addition to being a professor of communication at Stony Brook University, I also run the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, where we train scientists and engineers to communicate like human beings.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here today amongst these esteemed panelists. I'm Diana Moss. I work for the Progressive Policy Institute, a center-left think tank in Washington, D.C., and I run our competition policy program. Have done a career's worth of work in consolidation in the media space. And I am an economist by training and an adjunct professor in economics here at CU.
I'm Carl Quintanilla. I'm an anchor on CNBC. I've been with CNBC and NBC News for 25 years. Before that, I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in the Chicago Bureau. And CU grad, class of 93.
Can everyone in the back hear okay? Thumbs up if you can. Beautiful. Thank you so much. So we all know that journalism is changing. We know that audience habits are changing in terms of how they consume journalism and information more broadly. Technology is evolving. And of course, there's the issue of how attention itself is monetized in this day and age. People are looking for news in new places, and sometimes they are getting something that is not news at all, but is packaged to look just like it. We know that billionaires are increasingly buying out respected news outlets, sometimes hollowing out those news outlets and shaping them to their own desires and their own political views. But perhaps we're being too hard on those billionaires. We have to explore the question, right? The conversation is based around not a statement, but a question. So let's begin there. Do billionaires control the news? And I'd like to hear from each of our panelists around this, but perhaps mainly to start things off, Laura, if I might go to you first. We know that the wealthiest Americans have always been intertwined with journalism throughout history. And we know that American journalism has had a lot of pretty serious problems before the recent surge of billionaires buying up news outlets. So is billionaire ownership really the problem here?
Thank you for that question. And by the way, in addition to running the Alda Center, I spent six years as Dean of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. Communication is really a different field from journalism, but I learned an awful lot about journalists because they wanted to make sure I understood. And I found myself reflecting on this panel and thinking about, is it really about billionaires controlling the news? First of all, what is the news? There's a lot of news you can get from a lot of sources. Where does ownership of tech companies come in? And where you're even getting information channeled through. So that would be my piece that I would submit, that I think we should differentiate this question a little bit. That's not to say there aren't news channels owned by billionaires. I don't want to suggest that's not the case.
Well, I know, Diana, your work, right, is at the intersection with Antitrust and with journalism and with media. So again, the idea of the wealthiest interest in America shaping the news is not new. Is what's happening new? And does the question that we're posing here, does it meet the moment? This idea of, do billionaires control the news?
Excellent question for the times that we are living in right now, when almost every single merger proposed is going through the White House and is not going directly to our antitrust enforcers, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Trade Commission. Deals are getting worked out in advance with the administration, which has very much a political agenda to advance, and interference in mergers involving news stations. Take Nexstar Tegna, if you've been reading the headlines around that. Take Netflix, Warner Brothers, or Paramount, Warner Brothers. All of these deals are going to the White House first, interrupting what we would normally expect to see in terms of due process and the rule of law. With that said, we need competition in our media markets to promote not only diversity of viewpoint and free speech, which is tied inextricably into that. We need competition in all of our media markets to keep advertising rates low. We need competition in our markets to keep retransmission rates low, so that when you subscribe to, say, a cable company, you get those channels on your tiers so that you can watch news, you can watch local news. So we care about prices, we care about quality in our news, we care about our journalists and protecting our labor markets, but we also care about diversity of viewpoint, and that's why competition is essential.
Quick conflict of interest disclosure. For those who don't know, KUSA 9 News, long owned by Tegna. She mentioned the acquisition of Tegna by Nexstar, which is the owner of Fox 31 here in town. That is the acquisition that was previously approved by the Trump administration and is now being reviewed by federal courts. So just there's the conflict of interest. Carl, I want to make sure that we're being fair to the billionaires. And It occurs to me that you may have more access to billionaires than, say, the rest of us through your perch at CNBC and by covering business titans and so on and so forth. Because Colorado's billionaires won't talk to me, right? We have a couple, and they don't talk to the local news. The centimillionaires are very chatty people. They love to talk, but not the billionaires. So if you were a billionaire or knew one, what do you think they would make of the premise of this question, this idea that they control the news?
Well, I think they would first want to, as has already been suggested, are we talking about the news, like a newsroom, where reporters go out and collect information, which is then edited and curated? Or are we talking about like the free flow of information? I mean, if this is a discussion about Elon Musk and X, and Zuckerberg, and Facebook, Instagram, and the Ellisons, I guess, I mean, there's social media and pipes, and then there's newsroom. I think the newsroom question is a lot more complicated, because like there's all kinds of different human beings, there are all kinds of different billionaires, and some of them are helping media extract itself from really difficult financial models. And sometimes the only way that can be done is by bringing in a person who has run out of things to spend money on, which is, we can get into some examples of that. And some of their actual editorial policies have been helpful. We can talk about Bezos and the Washington Post. It's a little more cloudy, but I do think we need to separate the two. Are we talking about social media and pipes, or are we talking about reporters and editors?
Explain why you think that that's important, and I'd ask you to also delve into whether or not you think the average, the media news consumer distinguishes between the tube and what comes through it.
I think it's harder for a billionaire to work his way into a newsroom and affect the very complicated human interactions that go into crafting a story, crafting a headline, crafting a nut graph. That takes a lot of work. It's much easier to tell your IT department to remove fire some content moderators, or to unban someone who had posted racist content. They're just two very different missions for someone with that kind of money and that kind of time.
Corinne, what's it like working for a billionaire in a newsroom?
Well, as we've laid out a lot of examples, it's not necessarily a unique experience. It's not unique to the Washington Post. A lot of news outlets are owned by very wealthy people, which is why we're sitting here on this panel talking about it. I work on the opinion side, so I want to differentiate. I'm not a news reporter. There's separation between the two. And our day-to-day work is, I joined the Post because I really believed in the editorial board's new commitment to free markets and personal liberties. And so my day-to-day is guided by that when I'm writing editorials, and when we're discussing editorials as a team, I sit down with my colleagues and we think about the news of the day through that lens. It's something that we all agree on. And that's how we think about our day-to-day work. So that's what my experience has been like.
I think people would be curious, and if people in the room aren't curious, I'm curious, and I have the microphone, so I'm going to ask. So you know what the mandate is from Jeff Bezos, right? You know that the Washington Post opinion page is going to speak in support of the two pillars, right? You know, personal liberties, free markets. So when you sit down to have that conversation about shaping editorial writing, does he come up in conversation? Are there sub-directives below that main directive? Is it just, well, we know what that North Star is, so as long as we're in the light of that North Star, how does it practically work?
Well, I've certainly never gotten a call from him. So we really, I mean, I've worked in different newsrooms. I was on the editorial board at the Boston Globe. I was a fellow at the Wall Street Journal, and the way that the editorial conversations and process happens is similar. We sit down, you talk about the news of the day, and our work is really committed to these two pillars, free markets and personal liberties. And it's been just amazing to be in a room of like-minded people thinking about the news in that way. And our owner has said, I believe, it was, don't quote me on the date, but either a year or 2 years ago, wrote that there is a need for more of these conversations around those principles in our media environment, and I couldn't agree more, so that's why it's been fun to be a part of it.
I want to ask both you and Carl the same question, and might as well stick with you for a second just because you have the microphone. Do you feel like you have editorial independence, and what does that mean to you?
I feel like I have as much editorial independence as I've had in my other jobs. Of course, if it's an idea that my editor thinks needs fine-tuning, I'm going to get the same pushback that I've gotten in other places. So it just depends on what you mean by editorial independence. I am an editorial writer. I have my boss. A lot of us have bosses, and you got to make your boss happy. But I can say that personally, like, I go to these meetings with ideas. We talk about them, we discuss them, we debate them, and if people are excited about them, then good, go off and work on that. And that's been a pretty consistent experience. But at the Post in particular, again, it's really exciting because we are committing to these two pillars that you haven't seen as much of in the media, and that's why I wanted to be a part of the project.
Just a reminder again, if you have a question, shoot your hand up and one of the producers will come by with a note card for you. Carl, do you have editorial independence at CNBC, and what does that mean to you?
Yes. To me, it means, like, as Corinne said, not getting that phone call, not getting that tap on the shoulder, not hearing about it after a piece runs, not hearing about it after you've made an ad-lib comment on air. To me, that would be truly chilling, to have my boss call me in after a show and said, "Hey, you were kind of mean to, I don't know, pick a company. You touched the third rail on X, YZ." That would be worrisome. I would have to have some discussions with myself about my own future in the business, but it's never happened. It's just never happened. I'm not saying we're not incrementally moving into a period where that's more of a concern. I mean, I think for the most part, when people talk about the Post, for example, and at the LA Times, is if you pull an endorsement or you are changing your calculus around political endorsements, is that a reflection of the owner's viewpoint? I think that's when the discussion of all of this got probably the most heated in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I agree with everything you've said. I mean, that's never been my experience, that I've been told you can't write about that, you can't go there. And I think that sometimes having a North Star for the way that we think about editorials or the way that we discuss the news is conflated with this problem, and that's just not the case. We have these principles, we share these principles, and I'm lucky enough to work with people who agree on that. We all talk about the news that way, but nobody's off the table. If you read our editorials, we don't pull any punches for anyone. If you are not in line with those two pillars, then we're going to have something to say about it. And that happens a lot to a lot of people on every side of the aisle.
Laura, let me ask you, is the standard of Jeff Bezos' Post, where it's, here are the editorial interests that align with my personal interests, that's your North Star, go for that. Is that not a more transparent model for an editorial page than, say, the way that a lot of newspaper editorial pages worked for generations, where it was just, well, we stand for whatever is best for Buffalo, New York, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and what we put on this page just adheres to that community standard?
I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that. What I will say is, when I think about people my son's age, he's 22, and where he's getting news from, it's really different. It's not like he's necessarily going to the Post every day and he knows what the standard is there. So he's getting, like many of his friends, and even I to some extent, news through different sources that really appeal to the life you live in and the community you tend to engage with. So I worry a lot about algorithms and how much people are getting exposed to ideas. I'm really not sure. I think this is more of a question for the three of you to respond to, but that's what's going through my head.
And I do want us to talk later about the idea of take billionaire owners out of the picture and how do we address the issues around attention, around algorithms, and that kind of thing. I want to get to that in a moment. But Diana, let me ask you one question that I've asked myself as a journalist over the years, and just full disclosure, I mean, I've worked for 9 News here in town for 19 years, and a lot of folks don't believe me when I say that they have never editorially interfered with a single one of my reports, regardless of what political figure or what powerful organization it involved. They've required it to be fair and to be accurate, but there have never been strictures placed on it other than that. You tell people that and they don't believe it. And then I wonder myself, but have I been obeying in advance? And I just haven't brought them anything that is outside of guardrails. I'm curious what you think is happening within media these days, within ownership, in which journalists might have an understanding, even if it's not written on the wall, what they're going to cover, how they're going to cover it.
Sure. I think local news is a good place to start on that question. In a democracy, a free press is essential, and we get a free press, and we nurture and protect a free press by making sure we have different voices in the room. And local news has been a hallmark of very competitive markets, media markets in the United States. I don't want to pick on the Nexstar Tegna deal, given the disclaimer here, but that merger will eliminate head-to-head competition between newsrooms in multiple local markets. One of the first things to go when there's less competitive pressure on newsrooms to deliver high-quality, innovative news is viewpoint diversity. So I would love to ask the journalists here, all 3 of them, to what extent does your job and do you react to competitive pressures? If you're operating in a market and producing content for in that market, to what extent do the competitors that you face, your rivals, create pressures for you to really promote a variety of viewpoint, openness in viewpoint, as opposed to towing the party line? When we say billionaires, for me as an economist who works in antitrust and regulation, billionaires just translates into companies that have amassed an incredible amount of market power, economic power, so that they don't face competition and therefore can really ignore all of the competitive pressures, especially around viewpoint. So I think local news is really critical for us to maintain that. People really, they like their local news stations, right? They go to local news for emergencies, for weather, for local community developments and connection. And losing local competition in local news and sort of bringing it all up to this huge level where we have big national markets for news, I think does consumers a real disservice.
So not to awkwardly pivot away from local news, but Carl, can I ask you about your work on the national level? Who are your competitors? Who do you see as your competitors? How, if in any way, do they influence your work? And has your view on your competitors and who is a competitor changed in your decades in the business?
Our competitors in financial media, in television, it's Fox Business. We don't have a strong wire element, but certainly Dow Jones, Bloomberg are strong wire. Television in itself is kind of derivative. We take a lot of things from news wires and print and sort of mash it up for TV. I would say this is a really interesting point that Diana's made, and that's more about consolidation in general rather than just billionaires. But if you can imagine, when I went to school here, I interned at the Denver Post, and every discussion involved the Rocky Mountain News. What does the Rocky have? Does the Rocky have it? Is the Rocky going to go with it tonight? Should we go with it tonight? And that is where you get that's where your competitive news nature comes from. And once one side of that boat lists, not only are you not getting the intensity of news gathering, but you're also not getting the other viewpoint. All right, so we missed, Rocky got that story. How can we add to the story? You're not getting that second look at a story, which might involve a different point of view than you would have gotten otherwise. So that's, I mean, we've seen that in local newspapers. If that dynamic migrates to local television, that's just an added tragedy.
Karine, does competition factor into your world, or is that something that you think just happens on the other side of the wall at the Post? I mean, certainly you've spoken about the importance that you see in a diversity of viewpoints, which I think is what Mr. Bezos was talking about when he said, I want this viewpoint more represented in American discourse. But obviously, like, that one viewpoint is not diversity in and of itself. Like, there must be others. How do you see the diversity of viewpoints and competition interacting?
Just within my own.
From your perspective, being a slightly different lane, right, than the one that Carl occupies and the one that I occupy.
But I want to understand the question correctly. Competition with our competitors and other big newspapers, or just competition of ideas day to day?
I think it's whomever you see as your competition. I have a thought on this too, but I want to hear from all of you first. In terms of, do you feel like you have competitors in the idea space, or do you just operate in your own environment in which you can work? And then how do you see yourself fitting into, when you talk about diversity of viewpoints, of not just talking about your own, but what else is represented in the ecosystem?
Oh, sure, yeah. You don't get into the opinion business unless you think you have the best ideas and opinions. And the joy of being on an editorial board is then you have a team of people who, once we are able to reach some sort of consensus, which doesn't always happen, by the way, there's a lot of debate, it's always lively, the way that we don't always translate, at least at the beginning, we don't always translate what free markets and personal liberties looks like in each case that we consider. So there's even a lot of competition at that level, and that's actually the best part of the job, is having those debates and those lively arguments. But I just don't think that there's, even though I might think that we have the best ideas on our editorial board, I think it's great for the country, it's great for democracy to have competition across all major newspapers as all of our respective boards and opinion writers and columnists are putting out their ideas. I don't think that there can be enough competition in that way. So it's a privilege to be a part of that. But I will say, before the Post, I worked at the Boston Globe, and I had a column that leaned ideologically quite different to the rest of the opinion page, I think is fair to say. And that was also really fun because just Globe readers got to see some competition and ideas. So I am very pro-competition.
So just one thought on this from the local news angle, and I think this tees up a question to Laura about how we meld the two sides of this topic in terms of what's happening in the information space and in the news space these days with what we've talked about with competition. If you had asked me 15 years ago who our competition was at the local news at Channel 9, I'd say, well, it's Channel 31, Channel 4, and Channel 7, and so forth. And now, honestly, I feel like my competition is anything that anybody could be doing with their time other than consuming the news and information that I put out. And to that end, to the extent that my team at 9, the next team, has been able to carve out something in the politics and the policy and the analysis space, the competition really is not the other local television stations that are covering the car crashes and the fires and the murders and the other litany of tragedy. And them covering it lifts the burden on us to cover it. And when we get scooped in the politics and the policy space by another wonderful outlet like a Colorado Sun or something like that, it's actually kind of nice because then I can just recommend that work to my viewers and then we can spend our time on something else. And we're no longer bound by that newscast of record model of 20 years ago where we all have to cover the exact same things at the exact same time. If somebody else does a great job on it and they're trustworthy, I'll invite my viewers to go check that out, and then we'll spend our limited time and resources somewhere else. So, Laura, perhaps that takes us to the idea of, paint us a picture of what a healthier media ecosystem looks like than the one that we have now. What's in it? Who's in it? What would you change to make the system healthier?
You asked this question just as we are having more and more conversations about AI and information spread. A healthier ecosystem. I do think one that has healthy competition. I find myself questioning the funding model for journalism. And one thing that I saw in the 6 years as dean in the journalism students who came in, the numbers are going down nationally for enrollment in journalism. And you and I were talking before. You didn't study journalism, but you work on editorial. So it's not that you have to have studied journalism, but my God, we need journalism schools. I think that also help envision what that healthy news ecosystem is. I don't even know how to imagine what the education for journalists is right now, much less what that ecosystem needs to look like, especially as we're dealing with this really intense change in technology, and a technology that itself communicates and can put out quote unquote news stories, whether factual or not.
Carl, do you still recommend to young people that they consider journalism as a career?
Oh, yes. Yeah, but I was not a journalism major, and I don't necessarily recommend journalism majors. It always seemed to me, when I went here to see you, I think it was still offered as a major, but it always felt, no disrespect, but it always felt a little trade schooly, like the mechanics of reporting and how to organize a story. And so I was poli-sci. I will say that it doesn't really matter what you major in. If you're interested in journalism, you should go into journalism, but be aware that your education is going to happen in the first 5 years of your job. When I got to the Journal, I can remember nights where I thought I was going to puke, because the editor I was in the Chicago bureau, and the editor in New York, who was editing my copy on deadline, it's 4:45, the 2 stars going to bed, and he had questions for me that I hadn't gotten answers to yet, and that is the worst feeling in the world, and it is so formative. That's all going to happen on as we all know, is all going to happen anyway. So you can major in, major in math, major in science, because the rubber will meet the road those first couple of years where you realize how bad of a reporter you are.
This is true.
I do have to say, I think journalism schools and journalism education are super important. And I like that there's a diversity of backgrounds coming into journalism, but I'd have my head served to me on a plate if I didn't emphasize that.
I don't know. I want to push back on that idea of, are there a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of perspectives coming into journalism, right? I think, there's a reason, I think, why American media is perceived as left-leaning, right? And it's not without merit, and there's lots of ways that you can look at that and you can break that down. I also think that that's used to broad brush a lot of really good journalism just because there's not another effective critique of it. But I don't think that you can dismiss the characterization outright. Karina, I'm curious what you think of the idea of, is it a good thing or a bad thing that now young people who are interested in journalism can self-sort into organizations that ideologically align with them? Is that a positive development? Is that a negative development? Is it just, well, they all used to be libs and they'd all go into the one main tank together, and now there's some other silos? Take that wherever you want to take it.
I do agree that the overall bent of mainstream media is a reason why trust became so low. Don't quote me on the date, but I think sometime in the last 2 or 3 years, journalism as an institution had less trust than Congress, and the press had less trust, and that is shocking.
I would just interject, sorry, Carl, that's the national media, the local media. No, it's true, the local media trust numbers are decidedly different, but please, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I believe you.
Stay classy, Kyle.
I didn't mean for you to catch a stray there. I just want to make sure that we were on the record.
Yeah. But actually, I think now there have been so many changes over the last 2 years. I mean, where there is so much, going back to this idea of competition, there is so much competition at the major national news outlets in terms of ideology and how they are approaching the news. This is obviously more on the opinion side, but I think that that's great. And I think that it's great that national audiences are, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, getting exposure to a broad variety of just viewpoints. And it's not just the Post editorial board having these new pillars, the rise of the free press. And I think also just in the last couple of years, it's been a joy to see major opinion pages across the country, run a lot of op-eds that sort of have surprised me. And I've said, wow, I don't think that would have run while I was in college in the 2020s era, early 2020s era. So I completely agree that, actually talking a little bit about the news side too, I think I'll just speak anecdotally about a lot of the people that I know that went into news reporting all sort of looked at the world in a similar way. And so I think now there's a lot of work to be done to encourage young students of all different types of ideologies to pursue news and to be able to dream big, to not, you don't just have to sort yourself to places that necessarily match your ideology. I've always encouraged young people who want to be reporters, like, be ambitious, do good reporting, and dream big. Go to the biggest place if that's where you want to go. Don't stop yourself just because you don't think you necessarily belong there.
Kyle?
I would love to hear from you. It's interesting when you talked about people going into a place that reflects their beliefs, and I just think about all the incredible constructive friction that happens in newsrooms from people who do have different experiences and who do have different worldviews. And I hope that, I understand and respect the rise of the ideological outlet, but I hope we're able to preserve that, because, man, like, a frictionless newsroom is a scary newsroom.
Well,
and I know you're not saying a frictionless newsroom, but that's where my mind goes, and that's what I worry about.
I was about to say I encountered plenty of friction, plenty of lively debates in all the places that I've worked. So again, I think like having pillars doesn't mean having pillars that guide the way that you think about the world. We all have our own pillars, and I just happen to work with people that, our editorial board agrees broadly on pillars. That, again, that leads to a lot of lively debates on how we translate that. But no, I mean, like, at the end of the day, I think Americans want to be able to open the paper and say, I'm on the opinion side, which I love the transparency of that, because I think that there's less of the problem almost as an opinion and more just people's trust in news is very low. And we need to get to a place where people can read the news and at least agree on the basic facts of the news. And I think like that's the really big problem facing us.
I just want to add to this really terrific discussion and maybe build out a concept around the bigger media ecosystem, around competition and how important it is, and we've just heard how important it is. That there's two sides to there's two markets that we're really concerned about. One is the consumer market, right? We want to have choice about where we consume our local news. I would like, for example, to watch a more left-leaning state news source. There are other people who want to watch more right-leaning news sources. Some people want it straight down the middle. But having that choice is brought by having competition. So as consumers and citizens and voters, right, we need that competition to be fully informed and to get diversity of viewpoint. The market that Karina's talking about is the labor market for journalists, for content creators. Consolidation in the media hurts them too, because they lose choices about where they can go work. Right? If, like, the New York Times and the Washington Post bizarrely were to consolidate, that would take out one major potential employer of journalists. I've done a lot of work in the past with writers' guilds. So they are losing their minds over the Netflix, Warner Brothers deal, which did not go anywhere, and now they're losing their minds over Paramount, Warner Brothers. Why? Because we are eliminating competition in film studios. We are eliminating competition in streaming services. The Nexstar-Tegna merger eliminates competition in local TV stations. So if we care about attracting journalists to the profession, to create a steady flow of talented and skilled investigators and explorers, then we need to maintain competition for them too, so that they have choices about where they're going to go work.
I would agree. I might add, though, I mean, not to play too much devil's advocate, but although there is consolidation happening and it's not good from a jobs point of view, like I'm sure you know, Kyle, Punchbowl, Semaphore, Axios, 10 years ago did they exist? I mean, there's a constantly evolving undercurrent of new organizations cropping up. Punchbowl's basically one guy. Jake Sherman said, I think The Hill needs another news source, and boom, like they're getting well-funded, they're doing live events. I just think there is undergrowth, even as some of the big trees get felled.
I want to totally agree with what Carl just said, right? We do have new competitors in the space. We do have new business models. I mean, remember when Netflix just started and everyone was like, oh, there's this thing called Netflix out there. And now we have all these streaming services competing really hard with one another. So yes, we should accommodate and benefit from new business models, new services. But in the background, it's really important to protect that competition that's emerging in these markets and prevent undue consolidation that creates really powerful market players that can put a slant on the news.
I think we'd be remiss not to mention, though, the rise of the Substack model and just sort of this sort of general blogging model. I think right now, too, especially when it comes, it happens with straight news, but also especially when it comes to commentary, analysis, opinion, Substacks there's a lot of competition there. I mean, and the Free Press started as a Substack, for example, but a lot of people, I think right now, the news environment, a lot of people have trust in individuals and their personalities, and they have attachment to those individuals and their personalities, and so they're willing to pay whatever a month to just get that person's Substack on the labor market. Or, I mean, it's actually amazing how broad the offerings are. You can find a Substack for anything that matches your worldview. And that also goes for a lot of, especially for younger people, and people in my generation basically just consume the news via clips. And that that raises some concerns, right? Like, you don't always know that you can trust the person who is giving you news analysis via vertical video. But I'm really excited because at the Post, we've been really pushing on offering our news and analysis via video, both clipping from our podcast, Make It Make Sense, but also just doing video analyses of, like, when I write an op-ed, sometimes I just go straight to making a video of it so that people in my generation that might not read my op-ed are gonna consume it while they're scrolling.
So continuing our imaginary local versus national news beef, Carl, I wanna push back on what you said about some of the green shoots, right? So what I see is a lot of people who have built strong reputations in legacy media, then now stepping into news media and using that experience and credibility to create a little pocket for themselves, and hopefully, with luck and skill, a few other people. And then whoever else kind of gets shelved off on the outside, then so be it. And then my question is, so how does an emerging journalist who has not had that legacy media experience and credibility then go into that new media model with any expectation of a possibility of success when it is dominated by a lot of those people who are trading on the reputations they built in legacy media? And I would also note, you named the best of the best in that space. There's a lot of folks in that space trading on legacy media experience who are essentially just hot take artists who are extractive off of the work of an increasingly shrinking pool of journalists. That was not a question, it was a statement, but I'm going to ask you to respond anyway.
You're right to point to Terry Moran and Jim Acosta and Don Lemon, just to pick three, right? All pretty, at this point, left-leaning. But those are hot take baskets. The growth that I'm talking about is breaking news. Like, Punchbowl breaks news. Semaphore, I would say, much to CNBC's chagrin, breaks a lot of financial news, and certainly Axios and Politico have set a sort of a new standard. So I think they're different. If Don Lemon starts breaking a ton of news on his Substack, then his monetization model makes more sense to me. But right now, on those sort of opinion hot take, I don't know how long that lasts, because there's so many new personalities coming into the fold every day.
I want to start working in some of your questions here as we come up on 20 minutes remaining. And feel free to continue to submit them. I'll take a look at them, try to weave them into the conversation. I feel like we've touched on a number of things previously. Karine, this question. If a billionaire owner was hypothetically involved in a major scandal, could they dictate what is released to the public in order to silence injustices committed by them or their friends? And what does this mean for journalism? I understand that you don't work on the news side, but do you think that the owner of your outlet would be able to influence news coverage? And right in your wheelhouse, would you feel comfortable speaking critically about the owner of your outlet?
Our owner's been really clear that his he owns a lot of businesses, obviously, and that becomes a complexifier. Those are his words, so he has said this. But no, I don't think that. I feel, one, empowered to say whatever I believe. Our news side does great work breaking the news, and they will continue to do great work breaking the news, and that's not going to change.
Question from Mariah, who's a student, and I would pose this to you, Laura. Mariah says, college students like myself typically get access to our news on Reels, TikTok, not cable. How do news outlets consider informing young adults when the algorithm creates a bubble around us, shaping our understanding of current events? And I think that Mariah's question gets to the larger issue that we kind of touched on earlier and then set aside, which is, are we talking about the wrong problem? In that even if you fix the billionaire problem, you still have an algorithm attention problem.
This is what I'm struggling with through this whole conversation, because behind all of this is the funding model for, I mean, this has been a phenomenal shift from advertising base, that falling away, and opening a door for billionaire investment. And now looking at these tech industries, I mean, how much cross ownership is there? I really don't know, between news outlets and tech outlets, so you can sync up what stories are going to whom.
This question, and this is open swim for anybody who wants to jump on this. Why or at what point in time did the public lose their trust in the news media? Were we told that it was fake news? That sounds like somebody suggesting what the moment in time was. Or were there incidents that led to it? What precipitated the loss of trust in media?
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say we were ever like at the top of that list, but I think certainly the fragmentation of media after the internet came along, I mean, we did a panel this morning on the business of sports. Remember when the NFL, you could find it on what, maybe 2, maybe 3 networks, as opposed to now in multiple streaming channels. So I mean, I think it was more of a function of when you could publish your own newspaper and host your own newscast, that's when trust began to splinter as well as media itself.
Can I chime on this one?
Please.
Really fast. I think the loss of trust is actually pretty recent, and it is directly associated with the rise of misinformation, a lot of which is AI generated. When I was growing up in the 70s, when we had a lot of bipartisanship and not the kind of divisiveness in our society that we have now, it usually came from a very different place. Everybody relied on trusted news sources. They weren't so much disputing facts or truth. What they were doing is applying different viewpoints, social, political, cultural viewpoints, to a set of facts that people knew to be true. What we have now is the flip side of that. We have different fact sets that are all claiming to be facts and truth, a lot of which is not true. It's misinformation. So now you have people in conflict with one another because they are trying to reconcile different viewpoints around different sets of facts. And I think that's when the splinter really occurred.
I certainly think that AI and polarization create a big opportunity for, rising mistrust in the media. But again, I really think like people opening up the news and seeing actually what they weren't seeing reported and feeling like, my reality and the things that I'm seeing in the world, why aren't they being reflected? The things that I know to be true and the stories that I'm seeing, why aren't they being reflected the way that I'm seeing them? I think, I just really do think that the overall ideological bent of major news for a very long time also fractured trust deeply.
I have one thing I'd add. We just had last week, I think, or the week before, we had the 50th anniversary of All the President's Men, great movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, and I was doing a little Blue Sky thread on it. And Redford, who originally, I think he developed the script, he bought the rights to the book, and his mission was to convince Woodward and Bernstein to make this into a movie. And for months, neither would give Redford a call back. They would not return his calls. And later, Woodward, I think, was talking about Bernstein. No, it was Bernstein who said, Woodward came and said, Redford's calling, and he said, don't answer it. Don't. If Hollywood knew that we were talking to him about our book, that would lower trust in media. As opposed to today, where my pet peeve are journalists who are in movies. Like, it just drives me up a tree. I just think we've crossed some line somewhere where journalists decided they wanted to be actors, or they wanted to go to, I don't know, but that loss of purity, I think, was hugely damaging.
Karine, when you talk about the idea of people feeling like their experiences were not reflected in the media, I wonder if you're talking about their experiences, meaning the shared reality in which we live, or the values and the lenses by which they view their shared reality?
I think sometimes it is the latter, and ultimately, like, the news just needs to be what is truly happening out in the world and the facts, and that should always prevail. So I do think sometimes people people who feel they're in the ideological minority, sometimes their claims cloud that. It's not just about, again, this is just about, like, having the straight up facts in the news, and if you're upset about it not confirming your priors, that's not the point. But there is a real problem. I think I'm really optimistic, actually, but there is a real problem where stories were happening on the ground. I think immigration is one example. I think COVID's another example, where there were just stories that were not being told, and that had a lot of Americans scratch their heads and go, like, why is this not being reflected in major news outlets?
Carl, I'm curious to what extent you view your job as a journalist is to encourage people to live in a shared reality. That's something that I think about a bit and talk about with other journalists, just because, not to, like, really bring the room down from what's been a truly optimistic conversation, but if you look throughout human history, the times in which people did the absolute most unthinkable things to their neighbors is when people did not live in a shared reality with their neighbors, when they believed demonstrably untrue or just batty things about the people around them. And I think a lot about, like, have journalists lost the battle of convincing people that regardless of your views, we live in a shared reality together?
Fortunately, I live in a bit of a safe space covering markets. Markets are a great equalizer because the market's only doing one thing at a time, and you can be really mad about the Iran war, but you can't dispute the fact that stocks are basically flat since the day it began. So that raises all kinds of questions and challenges, maybe your personal worldview. And also, covering markets, there's always a bull debate and a bear debate, and we love to leverage that on cable TV. Let's have a bull-bear debate about whether we buy or sell NVIDIA here. And in participating in that debate, you have to agree on certain things. Now, you might want to prioritize one thing over another, but we all have the same set of metrics, and there's quarterly reports and commentary out of the conference calls. So in a sense, on Wall Street, like, we're forced to live with each other. We just have different ideas about what it all means.
Can I ask one clarifying question before Laura jumps in here? Do you see different things moving markets than you did 10 to 15 years ago in terms of the way information comes out and might manipulate the decisions that people make, or is it just the same old packaged in different ways?
Oh, no, I mean, we can get into, that's a totally different panel, but a younger generation that probably can't afford a house is not going to save for a down payment, and with that money, they will play in crypto, they will play in Polymarket, they will buy NVIDIA. So there's a long argument about what that's done to markets in the last, say, 2 or 3 years. It's created this whole cushion of liquidity that's like pushing the stock market down is like trying to push a beach ball underwater, because this younger generation is not spending money on the things they used to save for.
I want to go back to this question about divides and whose responsibility it is to bridge those. And I think that's a lot of weight to put on journalism. You're putting information out, people are sharing it, discussing it. I mean, every day the work we do at the Alda Center, and it's focused specifically on scientists, but helping people bridge divides, helping people listen across differences. I think we can't just expect this work to happen through journalism. It's got to be more comprehensive through other types of communication work as well.
This is an audience question. I'd like to start with Diana, and I would like to quickly hear from everybody up here. When so many news outlets appear, I think this word is slick. If it's not, it fits, so I'm just going to go with that. It's a little tough to read. When so many news outlets appear slick, how are consumers supposed to figure out whom to trust, to figure out what really happened? Advice for news consumers, and perhaps your personal view on how have you determined where to place your trust as a consumer?
That's a really, really good question. And I think Carl sort of hit on this in some of his comments earlier. When we talk about competition and quality and innovation and bringing all of this great reporting and news and packaging together for consumers while providing opportunities for writers and journalists, I've seen an incredible surge in what we call differentiated products, right? You're not just, as you switch through channels, you're not seeing exactly the same thing. Everyone out there is trying to make themselves just a little bit different than their competitor. And that's actually, from an economic standpoint, that's really a good thing, right? Having slightly different products which might meet the needs of different consumers is a good thing. And so I think what you're asking, Kyle, or what the audience member is asking is sort of struggling with that. We're not getting steady streams of identical content or product, and it's not packaged the same way. Everything is slightly different. So as consumers, we have to make more sophisticated choices about where we go and what we watch and what we listen to. And that does require a little bit more of decision-making and information and discretion on our part. So we have a heavier, bigger job to be able to make those choices.
Laura, advice to consumers on where to place their trust and how you've personally made that decision. Where to place your, and how you personally have made that decision in your life in terms of the news that you consume and where you place your personal trust.
I actually listen to a lot of the journalists we work with in the school. When I think about scientists interacting with journalists, sometimes they'll get pulled into challenging conversations. I'm sure you've seen some of the complexity, like around covering climate, and it's called thought diversity, and it's really not. But so I think what I'm saying is I want to be able to empower people to get out there, to get to news sources that we know actually adhere to the standards of good journalism and get their voices out in the mix. Boy, these are you've got me thinking about how complex all of this is, given how much information circulates in different locations and how people are drawn more and more to their own echo chambers.
Well, it's a very broad topic, and with lackluster moderation, we've ended up all over the place. Corinne, let me ask you, where do you place your trust in media? How did you arrive there? What would you advise other news consumers?
Well, of course, I advise them to read the Washington Post editorials. But no, I would say that read broadly, and my advice to, when I talk to college students, I say this a lot, but to just everyone, and I think this is good democratic hygiene too for the whole country, read something you disagree with at least once a day. Go to a news source that makes you cringe and read it once a day. And yeah, that's served me well. It served me well.
I would second that and pass the question down to Carl.
I would, that's a great piece. I love that. I think a news outlet that demonstrates a willingness to sort of buck at its reputation. Just one example, CBS is getting tons of flack for hiring Barry Weiss from the Free Press, and they're sort of an enemy of the left at the moment, but they did a very, very tough piece last week with an interview of a soldier who had been injured at this barrack that was attacked in the Middle East. And it's not the kind of piece you would have expected from a news organization that was rolling over for the administration. And of course, they've got a lot to prove if they're going to do changes to 60 Minutes and the evening news. But I think that willingness to surprise is generally a clue that the internal standards for news gathering are tough. And that by the time a piece makes its way to you, it's had the you-know-what kicked out of it. And that's generally a very healthy sign of a robust newsroom.
When you think of people getting news from prediction markets, how terrifying. Pardon me, I editorialized, there should have been some punctuation in this. How terrifying do you find the intersection of journalism and gaming? If you do, that's interesting, right? Because now we have prediction markets that are being packaged by news outlets. Carl, I feel like it's most natural to start with you on this. Thankfully, that's not in the local news space yet, but it seems like every day we hear about another news outlet that is weaving prediction markets into what they do.
It's very tough. I think CNBC, we do have a partnership with Kalshi, which is fairly new. I don't know a lot about it. We're generally not asked to refer to it on air. But like Polymarket apologized, the weekend before last, for a bet that made its way onto their site about whether or not those downed pilots would be rescued, which they said violated their internal safeguards, which I'm not sure what that means. But we had, again, with our panel this morning on the business of sports, prediction markets have displaced betting sites, which were already pretty much, still in their ascendance for 5 minutes. So the speed with which these business models are being dislocated is unbelievable.
Diana, a question from a viewer named me. In the regulatory environment these days, and I apologize, this is swerving back to something we talked about earlier, but we ended up on a really good topic. In the regulatory environment that exists these days, what guardrails are still holding, and which guardrails have been obliterated? We've talked so much about consumer choice and what consumers are going to do, but there is a regulatory framework, or there was at what point. What's gone, what's holding?
Well, I'll be really honest. We had a pretty good system in place. We had due process at the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission and all of our independent regulatory commissions. We had the rule of law holding supreme over all deals, mergers, business contracts, anything that would flow through some sort of government machinery for regulatory oversight. That is now gone. I will take the FCC as an example of the complete and total politicization and weaponization of an independent federal regulator. Brendan Carr, who is the chair of the FCC, is there only to do Trump's bidding. And that meant unilaterally, single-handedly, raising the cap on national audience reach for the Dexter-Tegna merger. This merger, the cap was 39%. Now the cap is 80%. Just to get that merger through. That means this very large merged company will be reaching 80% of national households. And if you have a particular political message to deliver, for all the reasons we were discussing earlier, then 80% of those households are going to be hearing that message. That should frighten the crap out of everybody in this room. So maybe in the next administration, we will get back to due process and the rule of law. But right now, it is a weaponized, politicized system. And really, the only guardrail in place, Kyle, is that consumers vote with their dollars. They vote with their dollars. So when Jimmy Kimmel got pulled off the air because he made a comment about Charlie Kirk, everybody dropped their subscriptions. And they said, we don't want to watch stuff coming out of news stations or a network that pulls Jimmy Kimmel off the air for speaking his mind about a political issue. So consumers need to remember to vote with their dollars.
I appreciate you rescuing my errant question and bringing it back around to where we were. This question feels somewhat off topic, but I just really admire Molly for shooting her shot, so I'm going to read it. And if Molly, if you wish to be identified in the room so that we can talk to you, wave your hand. I'm a freshman at CU Boulder. I am interested in becoming Secretary of State of the United States. As a reporter, and I guess there's three of us up here who are active journalists, you interview many senior officials. Of the ones you respect, what is one thing they do that makes them credible to you? Karine, we'll start with you. What makes a senior official credible to you? And again, you're addressing to the future Secretary of State.
Well, I would say that you're signing up for more jobs than just Secretary of State these days. That's a broad mandate these days. I think somebody who is willing to criticize their own party, yeah, and to do it publicly and vocally.
Carl, something that makes you respect someone in public life.
Yeah, that's a good one, but I like that one too. Rand Paul was on our air this morning, again, bucking a discussion about judicial warrants. And it is refreshing. You're like, again, it's kind of like the analog to the newsroom thing I was just talking about. If you are willing to surprise me by not being just a litmus test, it's impressive. I think that's all I have. Yeah. Oh wait, let me add. Any honest attempt to answer a question, you can almost. It's almost like a visceral thing. You can, when they return to the talking points they had in their mind, maybe it's just from interviewing people live all the time, every day, but you can see it in their eyes when they are like, I'm going to actually try to answer what you're asking me. It's a rare talent.
And Molly, I would just add from my perspective, I have the most respect for people in public life who change their minds about things and explain why, especially if they've been in it for a minute, right? When I speak to groups, whether it's students or people in public life, I always say, like, show me somebody who's been in public life for a long time who hasn't changed their mind, and right, at worst they're dumb or they're dishonest, and at best they're doctrinaire, and none of those three things are things that we want out of people in public life. So people who change their minds, because information changes over time. To bring us home here, we have 5 minutes left, and would like to give the floor to each one of you in turn to talk about, in summation, what is a realistic goal for American journalism and information, and what is just wishful thinking at this point, and perhaps something that we should dispense with and move on from? Laura, I'll start with you, please. A realistic goal for how our news and information ecosystem functions, and then something else that might be left in the past, for better or for worse.
Now it's on. I'd love to see more consumer awareness about what legitimate journalism is and where to get it.
Diana, your thoughts on this, a realistic hope for American news and journalism, and then something that might be behind us.
I would like to see the Band-Aid ripped off, the damage that a lot of AI is doing in terms of what news we see and the quality of that news and the viewpoint on that news. The faster and sooner we can get a handle on that with some AI regulation, I think the better chance we'll stand of getting things back on track.
Karine, your thoughts, a hope for the future and something that might be best left in the past, or is just left in the past?
I think my hope for the future is that there's going to be a lot more competition of ideas at the mainstream level, that people are going to have like a real serious, just diversified offerings there. And I think we're already on our way there, so that's great. This is more about just like production, how we think about how we package news, but I think left behind are the folks who think that, who hope that, and I'm sort of included here, but who hope that people are just going to read the news. We need to wake up and figure out how to package the news in a way that the next generation is actually going to interface with and is going to trust.
Consumption via obligation. Yeah. Carl, want to bring us home on this?
I guess I would say, I think the notion that media needs to somehow like unify us is probably a fool's errand, and I don't think we're in the business of unifying anybody. We had Larry Fink of BlackRock on our show a few quarters ago, and he said, the thing about America is our conversations tend to be really rough, and really robust and rude. It's always been like that. But because we have those discussions, it's like a family that looks dysfunctional, but they actually talk through stuff. And it's painful and loud and embarrassing, and the rest of the world probably thinks we're really coarse, but we kind of manage through these debates over time because we just have it out. A lot of other countries and cultures don't have that discussion. They never have that discussion, and as a result, their economies end up being really sclerotic. So I hope, to the broader point, like, we just keep showering you with a broad array of honest takes, and the country eventually makes up its mind.
That is a wonderful way to wrap things up. If a conversation can be both meandering due to me and meaningful due to them, I feel like this was. I appreciate all of you being here, both in person and online. Appreciate your interest in this very important topic when we knew there were more uplifting panels just right down the hall. Please join me in thanking each of our panelists here today. Thank you.